Welcome to the Restoration Activation Project video commentary series. Hi, Mary Ann here, and thank you for joining me. Due to widespread circulation of psychology-based theories and philosophies that really started kicking in the late 1950s and early 60s in terms of public awareness and acceptance, large segments of the population, particularly within Western and strongly Western influenced cultures, have at least heard the terms shadow self, shadow aspects of self, and shadow work, even if they're not necessarily conversant around those terms. Many on a self-mastery journey, and many others, are very familiar with these terms and are in fact engaged in various forms of shadow work. In this commentary, I'm going to look at what the shadow is, what shadow work entails, generally speaking, provide a few examples of shadow work processes, and how engaging a holistic approach to shadow work can expedite your self-mastery progression rates in light of the nearing evolution cycle convergence point. I'm going to begin by providing some information that relates why shadow work plays such a significant role in our efforts to more fully attune to and transduce divine core self-will by way of co-creationally aligning with soul's encoded purpose and unique purpose in this incarnation. So let's jump right in. The whole of manifest reality comprises layer upon layer of different regressive dominant, and more progressive regressive balanced realities, including different versions of realities, parallel realities, and realities within realities. This reality is a regressive dominant, self-regression oriented simulation of its original organic progressive dominant, self-progression oriented version. Incarnating here, particularly as the conscious evolution cycle convergence point nears, is a high-stakes proposition for progression-encoded souls. In other words, incarnating here holds the potential for both pronounced advancement and pronounced setbacks in soul's progress, due not solely to, but in large part, to the growing intensity of polarizations. There are many challenges for progression-encoded souls in this reality in terms of attuning to, transducing, and co-creationally aligning with divine will. I'll point out a few of the challenges that account for the degree of difficulty for progression-encoded souls who incarnate in this reality. Keeping in mind that incarnations are simultaneous because time is a nonlinear rather than linear unfoldment, incarnating in this simulation by way of the soul being required to extend and calibrate itself to multiple, unique, extremely dense, low vibration, gender-specific mind-body complexes across multiple lifetimes can be confusing and sometimes very traumatic for certain souls, and can even cause soul fragmentation in some cases. The soul must also, quote, consent to an overlay, in other words, an artificial soul. And this is described in detail in the Self-Mastery Guidebook, that, among other things, suppresses the soul's conscious awareness of not only its other incarnations, but of what it really is and its purpose. The regressed mind-body complex into which we incarnate in this simulation comprises a conscious-subconscious mind schism, unlike the original human mind-body complex, and a two-hemisphere split in the brain, both being features that inhibit realization of our innate self-wholeness by keeping us divided within, in the absence of essence layer of being identification. The acutely regressed mind-body complex into which we incarnate inherits the DNA impressed uncleared programming and unhealed trauma of not only its parents, but all of its other ancestors. Moreover, every social paradigm, societal construct, and inorganic operating system within this simulation is geared toward thwarting progression-oriented co-creation. In other words, regression-encoded souls flourish in their rates of progression in this incarnation. Now, however, once we understand the truth of what's going on here, a fundamental component of self-mastery attainment is coming to accept without judgment this reality as it is. Soul's progression unfolds from and through awareness, knowledge of, understanding, and acceptance of the way things really are, not the way we think they should be. In other words, we sabotage our core self-embodiment efforts when we're ignorant of, refuse to look at, or deny the way things really are. Now, this is not to be confused with approving of or not doing our part to counterpoise the regressive dominant state of collective consciousness and conditions of this reality as progression-encoded souls. Attunement to and co-creational alignment with soul's encoded purpose and its unique purpose in this incarnation are the very means by which we counterpoise the regressive dominant state of affairs here. If you've been on your journey for a while, you've likely come to realize that the divine will embodiment process is rife with paradoxes. So, though on the surface it might seem to mitigate or even subvert our efforts to counterpoise regressive co-creation, coming to a place of non-judgmental acceptance of the regressive dominant state of this reality actually facilitates attainment of energetic compatibility with perspectives that enable us to see that the myriad regression-conducive components of this simulation afford myriad opportunities to advance soul's progress by orders of magnitude. Hence my reference to incarnating in this reality as being a high-stakes proposition for progression-encoded souls. The prior mentioned regressive conducive conditions of this simulation illustrate the significant role that extensive shadow work plays in our self-mastery attainment efforts. Shadow work involves identifying, acknowledging, and then integrating, transmuting, or releasing the subconscious aspects of ourselves, our lives, and our co-creations we heretofore have been either unable or unwilling to see or acknowledge. The aspects of ourselves that we disown can turn against us, including not only those ego has categorized as undesirable, but also those which it has deemed to be, quote, desirable. Our personal shadows comprise all of these disowned parts. When we're unaware of or have not yet taken time to acknowledge and integrate or release them, our shadow aspects operate of their own accord. Our conscious selves slip into the passenger seat, and our subconscious shadow selves, by way of the ego, take control of the wheel. We end up doing things we wouldn't normally do and later regret. That is, if we catch them. We say things we wouldn't normally say. And our facial expressions and other body language often reveal emotions that we aren't consciously feeling. Lack of awareness or ignoring our shadow hurts not only our personal relationships, but our professional relationships. And it can undermine professional advancement opportunities. A completely denied shadow leads many to committing unscrupulous or even atrocious acts. When we can't see or refuse to look at and acknowledge our shadow aspects and qualities, we see them in others. In psychology jargon, this phenomenon is referred to as projecting. In other words, we project onto others aspects and qualities of ourselves that we're unaware of or refuse to acknowledge. For example, if you get upset when someone's rude to you, it could well be the case that you haven't yet seen or acknowledged your own rude behaviors or your capacity for rudeness. This doesn't mean that the individual isn't being rude to you, but if rudeness wasn't among your shadow's repertoire of disowned qualities, chances are another's rudeness wouldn't bother you or bother you as much. Most don't know they're projecting because it isn't a conscious level of mind sourced unfoldment. It stems from the subconscious mind. Projecting is a psychological mechanism used by the ego to defend and continue upholding its distorted perspectives and perceptions of self, others, and the unfoldments of this reality. Ego identification with and attachment to seeing and perceiving ourselves as either a quote good or bad person often keep us from applying sincere efforts toward ferreting out, facing, acknowledging, and then integrating, transmuting, or releasing our shadow aspects. Ego activation, alignment, and identification entrainment begin from the moment we enter this reality, largely through inculcation of prescribed beliefs, ideologies, and societal and cultural paradigms. Our resulting identifications, attachments, and projections distort our perceptions, our perspectives and perceptions of, and our responses to self, others, and the unfoldments of this reality. Because they're largely, if not solely, confined to the ego's highly subjective self-regression entrained conducive perspectives. Undertaking any form of subconscious layer healing and integration is beneficial. However, there's an art to engaging in this work in ways wherein you can experience its most empowering self-restorative effects. For instance, when shadow work is approached in the context of a specific aspect of ourselves or a particular issue in our lives or area of our lives, the benefits are far more dramatic. Excuse me. Most shadow work is approached solely from the psychological layer of being, which in itself can be very helpful. It's very important that we approach shadow work from that layer of being. But healing remains incomplete unless shadow work processes are also approached and addressed from all layers of our being. And this is the case for four primary reasons. First, the issues being addressed are often the result of not only unhealed personal and collective trauma experienced in this incarnation, but in others, or by other versions of ourselves in other realities. Second, if we're unaware of or refuse to acknowledge the existence, excuse me, of the interdensity dimensional regressive beings, entities, and forces operating in this reality, then our ability to fully heal and move beyond the after effects of trauma is severely limited because potential contributing factors are being overlooked. Third, trauma impacts us and can influence our co-creational output not only at our physical and psychological layers of being, but also and typically at our energetic, metaphysical, and the soul layer of our being. And as such, whole self-actualization entails addressing and healing our trauma at all layers of our being. And fourth, complete healing of trauma, both personal trauma and trauma that we've experienced as a result of intense societal level unfoldments, not only in this reality, but in this incarnation, but in others, is quite unlikely in the absence of at least some knowledge and understanding of higher order truths about ourselves and our many facets and faculties and how they function, as well as the many aspects and features of this reality and how it functions and its purpose. Suffering the after effects of physical, psychological, energetic, and soul layer trauma, and often the traumatic experiences themselves, is the result of attachment to our distortions, false beliefs, and misconceptions about ourselves, others, and reality. Now, there are several shadow work processes that many of you are likely very familiar with, that you've at least heard of if you've not engaged in some of them yourself. For example, core wound healing and inner child work, as well as ego identification and attachments or addictions release. Now, in a nutshell, I'll give you just a brief outline of those three processes. Core wound healing is the process of uncovering, acknowledging, and releasing your most deeply seated false beliefs about yourself. And a key step in this process is identifying pivotal early childhood, if not other life events. Some people are able to do that caused you to begin doubting yourself and your rightful place, quote, rightful place, in this or another reality. The two core false beliefs that arise from core wounding are, I'm not enough and I'm not good enough. Now, the Self-Mastery Guidebook provides a nice long list of how these distortions, these false beliefs, can play out in our lives, so that you can get an idea of if you need to engage in core wound healing work, or perhaps approach it from a more holistic perspective. Inner child healing and responsible reparenting is a multi-layered process of connecting with, coming to understand, healing, and learning how to become a loving, responsible parent to your inner child. Your inner child is one of many still intact aspects of your soul's innate personality. And there are processes that you can engage to bring them to light so that all of them can be reintegrated. But your inner child is a part of soul's innate personality that facilitates your capacity to experience and express wonderment, innocence, joy, playfulness, and sensitivity. But when inner child wounds and traumas aren't healed or aren't fully healed, they fester, and your inner child can become wayward, angry, spiteful, hateful, and even self-destructive. So obviously that's really important an important component of shadow work, an important process. Another process that you've likely heard of is, maybe not as directly, but ego identification and attachments or addictions release. This entails various processes for zeroing in on those things that ego uses to define, characterize, and aggrandize itself, thereby maintaining and continuously reinforcing itself and its dominion over our lives. This work comprises multiple facets, and including pinpointing, acknowledging, and clearing attachments that have unfolded from entrained ego or false self identification. And for a lot more information around false self identified attachments, if you haven't already watched it, I invite you to watch the Labyrinth of False Self-Identifications commentary. Due to generation-spanning entrainment, most humans, as well as genetic alterations and intense programming, most humans identify more, if not completely, with their egos than with their innate soul source personality or core self, and have given the ego full reign over their lives. The unchecked, unmastered ego derives its sense of self, identity, and well-being from things other than soul, core self-identification. And consequently, when certain external or externally obtained things are missing from our lives, our self-image is, quote, tarnished in our eyes, and our sense of self-worth diminished or totally obliterated. Distortion-driven, false belief-driven ego identification and its attendant attachments and addictions are primary causes of suffering. So working through some version of this process, of identifying and releasing our ego identifications, our ego self-identification that leads to an entire maze of false self-originating identifications, enables the regressive dominant, sometimes not so obvious thought, emotional, and behavioral patterns that have unfolded from them. So this is integral to our ability to make significant breakthroughs and progress on our journeys. And the purpose, another key purpose of ego identification and attachments addictions release process work, advance the rate of our transition from ego identified and directed co-creation, in other words, regressive dominant co-creation, to soul and core self-identified and directed co-creation, in other words, progressive dominant co-creation. Another shadow work process that you may be familiar with, at least you've heard of, is soul retrieval and reintegration. And this, from a high level perspective, is the process of locating, reclaiming, and reintegrating facets or splinters of the soul that have distanced themselves from the mind-body complex as a result of psychological and or physical trauma, including sexual abuse and direct soul-level trauma. In other words, trauma the soul was subjected to between incarnations. Now, again, the Self-Mastery Guidebook goes deeply into soul fragment retrieval and reintegration, but I'll provide a few common symptoms of fragmentation. There are many, but this entire, as I mentioned at the beginning, this reality is highly conducive. Just incarnating in this reality is highly conducive, and one reason many people come into this reality, already experiencing soul fragmentation. And like I said, there are many common symptoms of fragmentation. Another of these is, or I should say, one of these is dissociation, where the individual does not feel as if he or she is fully in the mind-body complex or fully engaged in life. Some other symptoms include chronic depression, suicidal thoughts, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, immune deficiency problems, and grief that you just can't seem to heal. Now, what society deems as psychological disorders, such as depression or PTSD, these are often key mechanism. These unfoldments afford information about the kind of work that we do need to do, because they're telling us things about ourselves. They reveal to us aspects of ourselves that we're either not acknowledging, or that we're not, that we're deeply ego identified, and a myriad of other things that we can use then toward integrating, to becoming, actualizing our innate self-wholeness. This is in contrast to certain psychological, so-called psychological, primarily, but a number of things contribute, but psychological disorders such as psychopathy or narcissism, which are something else altogether. And again, the Self-Mastery Guidebook goes deeply into those particular disorders, and I will in just a moment dive into them a little more deeply. So those are just, I'll give you a few more examples of some of the symptoms of soul fragmentation, possible symptoms. Addictions. Those are typically signs of fragmentation, wherein we're seeking external means of filling that inner emptiness that we feel by using drugs, alcohol, food, or other substances that aren't necessarily good for us, or by way of trying to fill this empty feeling by way of relationships, or through our relationships and interactions with others, by becoming workaholics and becoming deeply attached and identified with material possessions, for example. If you feel as if you've never, quote, never been the same since a particular event or series of events unfolded in your life, then fragmentation has probably occurred. Planetary-wide, so fragmentation is readily apparent, along with rapidly increasing numbers of individuals whose souls are so fragmented that retrieval and integration of all their shards are virtually impossible. And mind-body complexes that have no organic souls at all, for a variety of reasons, and are thus functioning solely in response to ego, artificial soul, and instinct-sourced impulses. The result being that most, if not all, of the co-creational choices of these individuals are regressive dominant. And therefore, their consciousness, in other words, their consciousness is being directed or been completely overtaken by the consciousness of others, or in some cases, it's purely technology directed. For example, artificial soul directed technologies that are artificial soul technologies that direct us to regressive dominant co-creation. Another shadow work process that you're likely familiar with is toxic relationship recovery. And this is the process of consciously acknowledging and departing as appropriate, if you haven't already, then identifying, coming to grips with, and healing the after effects of a toxic relationship. Any relationship that undermines your or others' physical, psychological, energetic, or soul level well being is toxic. Toxic relationships can be distinguished from those which are merely troublesome by way of their poisonous atmospheres. They often prevent those involved from being able to live healthy, productive lives at all. Toxic relationships aren't solely the byproduct of two unhealed people coming together. In some cases, psychologically disordered individuals target and prey upon healthy, by and large, stable people for their own personal service to self oriented needs and gratification. These predators feed and thrive upon the emotional, psychological, physical life force and density energies of others, taking as much as possible for their own service to self purposes. Many of them are psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, or borderline personality disordered individuals who make ideal part-time or full-time hosts for regressive beings and entities who use them to fulfill their service to self desires and agendas. These individuals are extremely controlling, manipulative, often triangulating or otherwise maneuvering their way into any relationship they perceive as self-benefiting. Toxic people are rarely, if ever, aware of their own toxicity. They're so totally consumed by their own desires, needs, interests, and goals, or those of the entities who are manipulating them, that they're either completely unaware of or simply don't care about the desires, needs, interests, or goals of others. But not all toxic relationships involve narcissists, psychopaths, or others with extreme psychological conditions or symptomology. Many are the result of well intentioned people who lack relationship and other core life skills, as well as awareness and understanding of higher order objective truths about themselves and reality. And again, Self Mastery Guidebook delves more deeply into toxic relationships and how that works. Now, and how to, that process works, toxic relationship recovery. Now, I'm going to talk about now a couple of shadow work processes that you may or may not, and most likely have not heard of. One of them being personal timeline clearing work. Now, this is a dynamic, multimodality process of using present moment aware consciousness in combination with targeted, intentional, past, and potential future projected consciousness in order to heal and thus eliminate the regressive effects of traumatic past, present, and future events upon our co-creational choices in the here and now. Many of the kinds of things we experience in present time unfoldments and the ways in which we experience them are tied directly to soul level memories and impressions of all of our most deeply impactful experiences and responses to them within all incarnations or across all incarnations and versions of ourselves, across all density dimensions, timelines, and realities in which we've existed. Their accrued effects upon our present time consciousness, in other words, our current thought, emotion, and behavioral responses and patterns, underpin, shape, and color that which we are experiencing and therefore co-creating now. This process, when approached holistically, taking into account all layers of our being, affords attunement to an energetic alignment with higher awareness perspectives of present as well as other timeline unfoldments, thereby enabling more progression-oriented co-creational responses. When this process is strategically integrated with and dovetail with other healing tools and processes, for example, soul retrieval, core wound and inner child healing, or ego identification and attachments release work, the personal timeline clearing process yields extremely potent progression outcomes. In other words, we're able to oftentimes make great leaps on our journey. So that's a key process. And one more key process that you might not have heard of is ancestral or bloodline trauma healing and programming clearing. This again is a multi-layered, multimodality process of identifying, then healing unhealed trauma and clearing embedded regressive programming that the mind-body complex inherited from birth parents and their ancestors. In other words, that when upon incarnation into this reality, we inherit all of that. Unhealed trauma and embedded regressive programming regress the soul's genome and therefore the genome of the mind-body complex, because cumulative unreleased trauma and programming induced thoughts, emotions, and behavioral energies inhibit both genomes' fullest possible functional capacities. Eventually, these unhealed energies damage or atrophy their correlative genome encoding to the point of deactivation. The mind-body complex genome comprises, in part, a composite of the genetic encoding of our corporeal parents across all incarnations. Their genomes comprised a composite of the genetic encoding of their parents, and so on. It's in this way that we take on the programming and unhealed trauma of ancestral mind-body complexes by way of the engineered corporeal conception birth process in this reality. Therefore, healing encompasses addressing not only the trauma and programming we've been subjected to in our own lives in this incarnation and others, but that which was not healed and cleared by our biophysiological parents prior to our conception. In other words, any resultant genome damage is an innate constituent of our biophysiologically inherited genetic encoding. Now, this process is not about healing our parents or other ancestors. It does, however, afford a highly effective means of helping to clear and heal within ourselves the programming and trauma that we take on by default simply by incarnating into this reality. The real beauty of this process, as I've already alluded to, is that it facilitates healing of trauma and releasing regressive programming not only in this lifetime, but across our other incarnations and versions of ourselves. Again, this is another highly productive, potent process that involves multiple modalities. And it's important to understand, this is, as I said, there is an art to, particularly to holistic shadow work. Another key aspect of holistic shadow work is our ability to engage the subconscious mind. And finding effective means of perceiving and bringing some level of, quote, order to the vast, unwieldy, chaotic subconscious is a crucial first step toward its integration. Since the initial stirrings of the subconscious layer of the human psyche, once wholly integrated constituents of soul's personality, have splintered into various quite distinct aspects of soul's personality that have largely taken up residence, so to speak, in the subconscious as a consequence of ego-identified states of being and co-creation. And as I mentioned before, this subconscious mind engagement is a key component of shadow work processes that enable us to attune to, get to know, reacquaint ourselves with the various aspects of soul's innate personality, the inner child being one of them. And generally speaking, there are 8 primary aspects of soul's innate personality that it's very important that we're able to reconnect with and work with toward their integration and full-time residence in the conscious layer of the mind. So it's very important that in the case of all of these processes, that we learn how to safely, responsibly access and maintain focused conscious attention on the subconscious while we're, quote, in it, so to speak. And there are a number of techniques that can be learned, all of them unfolding through activated parasympathetic nervous system physiology within the mind-body complex, PNS physiology. This is all explained in the book as well. One of the simplest, most direct methods of PNS activation for the purpose of accessing the subconscious is through attainment of a light meditative state. Again, the book gets deeper into this particular component of shadow work. And another key component of shadow work, which many believe they're addressing, but they aren't really, the emotional aspect, the emotion clearing aspect of this work. And this is one of the pitfalls of approaching shadow work purely from the much publicized psychology-based theories around shadow work, which are very helpful. In other words, most people feel they've addressed their suppressed emotions simply because they've been able to identify or recognize certain emotions and connect them to certain events. It's like, oh yeah, okay. I see now that I was coming from a place of anger when I responded to my employee's question. That's not the same as consciously experiencing and releasing these suppressed emotions. And emotion hygiene is another key aspect of this work. Knowing how to, for all of these processes and any tools you're using, how to engage in them in ways that are safe and self-responsible. In other words, in ways that don't leave us vulnerable to increased or more intense psychic attacks or regressive force interference, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of others. Certain tools and practices that are used, when used irresponsibly, can also subject other people in our lives to regressive being interference and attacks. And we don't even know that that's what's happening, or that something that we have some process or technique that we've engaged in has facilitated that unfoldment. A foundational component of self-mastery work that a lot of people do not fully understand or are not, for whatever reason, willing to embrace is reclaiming full self-responsibility for all of the things we do, the ways in which we're doing things, and the effects of the things we're doing. Now, I should say the potential effects. And there are many ways that we can mitigate, if not completely prevent, potentially harmful effects, as I said, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of others. When we know how to protect ourselves, how to take steps to ensure that when we're in these meditative states, doing shadow work and other such processes, that we don't leave ourselves vulnerable to interference, or worse, to entity attachment. I can't tell you how many times, how many clients I've worked with that come to me with such issues. And once they relate that they've been engaging in certain practices or processes, and then I find out what the particular steps that they're taking, typically involving asking for the permission or protection of some other entity, for example, an angel, an archangel, an ascended master, or a spiritual guide, then it's Steps like that can leave us highly susceptible and even prone to entity interference and attacks, either directly or by way through other people. So engaging in these processes and any other tools and disciplines, it's incumbent upon us to learn how to engage in them in ways that are safe and self-responsible. Now, there are many benefits, and I've touched on a number of them, to taking a holistic approach to shadow work and other self-mastery work that we're engaging in. But I've distilled it down into four key benefits of a holistic approach to shadow work and other self-mastery work. We are able to attain higher awareness perspectives and perceptions because we're clearing away regressive programming and trauma at every layer of our being, which facilitates greater attunement to and co-creational alignment with divine core self wisdom and will. The more you become aware of and integrate your shadow aspects or release certain aspects as appropriate, the more you're able to perceive, attune to, and actualize your inherent self-wholeness. And actualized self-wholeness enables higher awareness of and attunement to our innate faculties for apperceiving, aligning with, and embodying core self-consciousness and will, which is the overarching purpose of engaging in the process of self-mastery. The next key benefit is enhanced physical, psychological, emotional, energetic, and soul level integrity and well-being. Varying degrees of fatigue, lethargy, and apathy plague many progression-encoded individuals who are not aware of or refuse to acknowledge certain aspects of themselves and this reality. This causes a constant drain of energy that, when left unaddressed, can be compared to dragging around a huge bag of bricks, one they don't even know they're dragging around. And that massive energy drain often leads to misdiagnosed psychological and physical disorders, to pain and disease. Shadow work, particularly holistic shadow work, facilitates reclamation of the tremendous wellspring of energy you've been investing in defending, hiding from, and lying about yourself to yourself and others. The third key benefit is healthier relationships and interactions with others. As you get to know, come to terms with, and integrate your shadow aspects, and become a responsible administrator thereof, you're more able to see yourself as you really are. You become more grounded in this incarnation and focused in your self-mastery attainment efforts. And your co-creations thereby more core self-will attuned rather than egoic will directed. And a fourth key benefit of holistic shadow work is increased creativity. And I'm talking about authentic creativity, not recreation, simulating, duplicating with just a few changes, or copying things that are already out there. I'm talking about true, original, self-originating perspectives, thoughts, ideas that are so sorely lacking in this simulation. Increased creativity is a spontaneous unfoldment in the lives of those who reclaim their innate self-whole states of being, actualize self-wholeness, and self-wholeness informed co-creation. Unlocking and tapping into more of your creative potential is one of the greatest, most rewarding, and most empowering benefits of holistic shadow work. On that note, I'm going to call it a wrap for this commentary. I've provided a lot of information that I hope will stimulate within you inner knowing around these things and understandings of what holistic shadow work really means and a holistic approach to all self-mastery, self-work processes and tools and practices and disciplines. If you found this commentary to be of benefit and you haven't already done so, I invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or on my website, where you will be notified not only of new commentaries as they're released, but also various online courses and programs that are currently in the works when they're released. And also, those of you who purchase the Self-Mastery Guidebook, and if you've already purchased it and this link wasn't included, then you're invited as well. But if you purchase, beginning today, the Self-Mastery Guidebook, you will find a link at the very end of the About the Author section of the book that gives you, if you click on the link, you have access to a free 1-hour session with me, at the end of which you receive a practical next steps action plan that you can implement immediately toward helping you advance on your own unique journey. Until we meet again, take care on your journey. Stay safe. Bye for now.